Hello, my name is Mark Thomas. I'm Helpline Manager for the Farming Community Network. And today it's my pleasure to be speaking with John Martin. John is a Nuffield Scholar and he farms in County Down, Northern Ireland. This interview is part of a joint initiative between FCN, the Nuffield Farming Scholarships Trust, and Focused Farmers. And the aim is to encourage people in the farming community to build resilience and to plan for the future. And today we're going to be talking about succession planning. John, thank you very much for your time today. It's great to have you here. I'm hoping that the technology and the Amazon deliveries don't cause us any problems. Perhaps we could start by you telling us a little bit about yourself, a bit about your Nuffield, and introduce us to your farm.
Okay, thanks, Mark. Hello, everybody. My name is John Martin. I'm a 2011 Nuffield Scholar, and I looked at improving the capacity to manage change on family farms. And really, what I was looking at in that study was, firstly, the succession process and how that is managed in other parts of the world, perhaps more successfully than sometimes here in the UK, but also then how the next generation acquire the management ability to take over the running of the business from the older generation. So there were sort of two aspects really to the study. And it was prompted, I suppose, really because in Northern Ireland we're more or less 100% owner-occupied farms, mainly family farming businesses. So maybe somewhat different in structure to the rest of the UK. We don't have tenanted farms, and we don't have the same scale of larger farming companies. So that I really looked at a range of different succession and business planning models in Australia, New Zealand, Finland, and a few other places as well. That was some time ago. Sure. So on my here we're mainly livestock, it's a grassland area, sort of on the east coast of Northern Ireland. At the moment, we're focusing mainly on intensive sheep production with a little bit of cereals, but also then biomass, so short rotation coppice willow producing wood chip for sale as a renewable fuel. So a little bit of diversity there. Hopefully gives us some resilience going forward, because obviously we're entering somewhat uncharted territory as we leave the European Union and trade relations.
Indeed we are. And John, if you could try and sum up in a few words, what does succession planning mean to you, and why is it important?
Well, as I mentioned, we're mainly owner-occupied family farms in Northern Ireland, and I'm aware of some instances where there have been issues and difficulties involving the succession process within families. Transfer between the generations, but also where there maybe are siblings who have been farming together, once the older generation is no longer around and things have to get sorted out, there have been problems that have arisen. So I suppose that's what really spurred me on to have a bit more of an in-depth look at how the process operates, to see if there were some ways that we could maybe bring some improvement and smooth the system out for all concerned.
And what in your studies, and in your experience, what have you found really to be the main barriers to successful succession planning?
Well, I think certainly in the UK, we're very reluctant to talk about succession planning. It's one of those things that that people keep putting off. It's always something for a rainy day, or for tomorrow, and that day never seems to come. We're tied to the seasonal aspect of agriculture. Whether it's sowing or harvesting or lambing or calving, there's always those seasonal things that are going on, and succession planning is one of those things. It's not time bound, so it tends just to get put onto the long finger and keep getting pushed back. Would be the main issue, it seems. So there's no, and I think the other thing probably is that there's a lack of openness and a lack of discussion, and that was one of the things I saw in other parts of the world where from a young age children are being there's a family discussion around what they would like to do going forward and what their long-term plans are, and so they feel part of a discussion and it's open and it's much easier to talk about. So I would think those are probably the two main things that would be an issue, and why it becomes so difficult. I suppose lack of profitability also, and the financial aspect can also be a problem. And particularly if farm businesses aren't particularly profitable, that means that there isn't necessarily the funds available to for the older generation to easily retire and the next generation to step up and take over the business, because there simply isn't enough profitability and financial security to facilitate that, particularly in smaller family businesses.
Sure. And you started to talk about this there, but could you share any examples of a way you found succession planning being done really well, in your opinion?
I suppose probably the key thing that I saw was where there was somebody else being brought in to facilitate the process, and that doesn't have to be a dedicated succession planning facilitator. That just an outside party or a third party, a family friend, for example, somebody can help to initiate that discussion. And very often it's difficult for the younger generation to raise the subject. And there are plenty of examples where the older generation retain control of the business well into their well past retirement age, and the next generation have very little control or involvement in the day-to-day. They do in the day-to-day work, but in terms of the strategic planning and the management of the business. So I think by bringing in a third party, or using a third party as a way to raise the subject, could be a bank manager, could be an accountant, solicitor. There are other people that businesses deal with on a regular basis, and it could be possible then for those people to help. But I think that was the biggest thing that I saw, was somebody who was outside of the business that helped with that process, and that's probably the key thing. In absence of that, if you can try and raise the subject, it's not always easy. Just make sure that everybody is aware of what everybody's long-term aim is, or have a discussion over a cup of tea someday. Where do you see yourself in 5 years' time, 10 years' time? Is Dad going to be retired, or mum and Dad going to? Would they like to step back and have a bit more free time and that type of thing? So there are ways of doing it, but it's not an easy discussion to begin. And one of the other good examples that I saw was a couple who were farming in Victoria in Australia, and they had 3 sons and who were sort of late teens, early 20s, and then a much younger daughter. But what they had done was they had formed a family board, if you like. So mum and dad and the 3 sons were on the board, and the expectation was that when the daughter was a few years older, that she would also join. So they were farming three dairy units, and they had managers on 2 of the units, and then mum and dad were running the home place. So what they were hoping, or they were just, whenever I was there, they were anticipating one of the sons bringing a proposal to the family board, if you like, to take over running of one of the units. So everybody was involved in the discussion, and the parents were there to provide advice, and while the son was also prepared a business plan and so on. So he had to satisfy himself that it was workable. He also then had to convince parents that yes, the numbers that he was talking about were feasible. But they could see then that the next generation were approaching this in a business-like manner. But also, obviously, then there were the other siblings could see what the intentions were, but there was no pressure either way for any of the children to participate in the business going forward. But speaking to the parents, the key thing that came out of that was that everything was out in the open. Everybody knew because what the debt was behind the business, because that's often something that's unseen, and particularly where you have a number of siblings and one of them takes over the farm, and the other siblings, may look very jealously at that, and but what they may not see is the debt and the borrowing, which can in some cases be very significant behind all of that, and they just say, oh, well, my brother or sister has, been handed this all on a plate. When in actual fact, they've taken on liability for a significant amount of debt as well. So it's not just maybe as things appear. So that was just quite an interesting example. And I suppose the other thing that demonstrates is that even at a relatively modest level of family farming, you don't have to be an international farming company. You can adopt some of the practices of multinational businesses, just by introducing a board. Some of the other examples where boards had been developed, they brought in an outside party, perhaps as a non-executive member or as an independent chairman. So by having that type of structure, the parents, even if they do decide to retire and step back from the day-to-day management, they have a wealth of experience that the board and the next generation can continue to draw upon. And once they become comfortable that son or daughter that has taken over the business, they really know what they're doing, then they can ease back, and it's a natural progression. So yeah, I suppose that's quite a good example of how things can be done.
Indeed, that's really interesting insight, John. And your point about looking for best practice, as you say, you don't need to be a huge organization. Best practice exists in many places. I think that's a really, really useful tip. Now, for some reason, I think my background has disappeared, and now revealed that we're recording this in the lead up to Christmas with my rather sad Christmas tree in the background. So I don't know quite why that happened, but clearly Zoom didn't like my image of Hampshire farmland behind me. So anyway, we'll carry on regardless. So thinking a bit more closer to home, perhaps, John, how have you approached succession planning with regards to your own business?
I suppose I've been very fortunate. My parents have always been quite inclusive in terms of the business discussion. I have a younger brother and sister. My brother's an accountant, and my sister works in PR and marketing. So I did an agricultural course, but I guess we never really had the discussion about, well, who's going to stick their hand up, who wants to come home. But I went to college, and my brother, I guess, assumed that obviously I was going to return to the farm, and he was happy enough to follow the accountancy route. So say my parents have been very inclusive. So whenever I returned from my college about 30 years ago, sorry, yeah, more like 35 years ago, actually, getting now, so much time has passed. But I was included in the discussions with the bank manager, the accountant, and solicitor, whatever was going on. So from day one, I was involved in that, and I think that's key, because again, very often we see that the parents deal with that side of the business, and the next generation are excluded, and that makes it even more difficult to try and address the issue if you don't really know what's going on. So that was key. And then before I was married in 1996, so there was transfer of land took place around that, and then subsequently the remainder of the assets passed from my parents. Now, my father's he's 82 now. He's still very active. He still likes to get out every day. No pressure from me to do that, but he says he'd rather wear out as rust. But he's quite happy doing it, but he doesn't carry the pressure or the responsibility then of the day-to-day financial management and the sort of the strategic direction. But he's very useful, and we still have the conversations about what do you think about maybe doing things differently, a new enterprise, or changing a piece of machinery, or whatever. So it's useful to have the experience there in the background. I suppose the other thing that maybe happens in the UK that is less common in other parts of the world is where parents can put in place life insurance or financial investments for other siblings that maybe aren't going to be involved in the family farming business. In New Zealand, for example, they're more likely to, particularly if they're farming a number of dairy properties, that the property may pass, and those non-farming siblings may have a manager or a share farmer running that for them. So they may have an interest, so they have an asset, but maybe not directly farming themselves. In the UK, it's more likely to be, some form of financial planning that assists with providing for non-farming siblings.
And John, for anyone who's finding this a really difficult subject to get started on, to broach within the family and on the farm, what advice could you give to them? What help could you give to them to get started?
Well, there are one or two succession planning consultants in the UK. Sean Bushell, Heather Wildman, and a number of others. So, if just go on and Google, and you'll get a few names coming up. Again, I'm happy to talk to anybody that wants to have a conversation. I'm not a financial planning or succession consultant, but I can point them in the direction if somebody wants to do that. I suppose the other thing that I did see in my travels was that where succession had been handled successfully between generations, that was likely to be repeated the following generation. Where it has been much more messy, again, that untidy transfer is likely to be repeated. So it's how we break that cycle. And by bringing in an external person, then that's a way of helping to break the cycle.
That's good tips, John. Thanks for that. And thinking about perhaps from a UK perspective, what lies ahead, the changes that are coming around the corner from the point of view of Brexit and the changes to the support system. How do you see that affecting succession planning over the years ahead?
Well, I think where everything's nice and stable, and things are just going along, and everything's relatively settled, it's much easier to to carry on. And you can plan for the future a little bit in that type of environment. Where we're now faced with very significant upset and change to the models that we have known for farming markets and so on. That's all being turned on its head at the present time. Obviously, with coronavirus, there has been significant change in some sectors, particularly, but now Brexit and whatever form trade deals will take going forward. Support for agriculture, certainly in England, is going to change very radically in the next few years, and it's likely that the same will happen, or something similar will happen in other parts of the UK that involve administrations. So that type of uncertainty and turmoil is very hard to deal with, and unfortunately, particularly if some sectors are hit particularly hard, depending on which part of the country you're in, the options for alternative enterprises may be very limited. If you're in an upland area, for example, or hill and sheep, something like that. Now, obviously, there's a push towards forestry and so on. Everybody will have to deal with the issues that are before them as we go forward. But where there are issues that are affecting your business in a significant manner, please don't be afraid to reach out and talk to people like Farming Community Network and others to get advice and because they can point you in the direction of people who can provide real assistance. And I think that's a very important thing. Of course, there will be opportunities going forward as well, and we have to be able to identify and see those opportunities. And very often it's the younger generation who perhaps can see a way forward and identify an opportunity that hasn't previously been existed or been exploited. So I think again, research has shown that people under 40, for example, are much more likely to probably take risks because they're less concerned about the implication maybe than their parents, for example. But without being rash, you're more likely to adopt new techniques and new business opportunities to be exploited.
And just finally, John, what would be your key message to those people who are watching this interview on the subject of succession planning? What's your real top tip?
I suppose the key thing is communication. Talk within your family. Try and understand what everybody really wants. Sometimes there is an assumption that a particular son or daughter is just going to come home and take over the farm, and in actual fact that may not be what they really want. And there may be somebody else in the family who would be more comfortable, or that would be their long-term aim. So I think communication, start talking about the subject, don't hide it, and get it out in the open. Have a discussion around the table. Don't, the format that facilitators will take is that they'll speak to a family group as a unit and try and get some sort of sense of where they are now, and what particularly from the parents' point of view, if they have instigated the process, which happens sometimes, where they would like to be. They'll also then speak individually to each of the family members, and sometimes that can create it could be a bit of an eye opener for other family members when they maybe made assumptions, and that's not actually what those individuals want. So I think talk about the subject, be open, be frank, and try not to be set preconditions or have decided the outcome before that you have the conversation or the discussion. Try and listen to the views and desires of the other family members. And somebody said to me in New Zealand that at the end of the succession planning process, what they wanted was to be able to that all members of the family were still talking to each other, and that was everything else was secondary. So they wanted to make sure that they maintained good relationships within the family, between the parents and their children, and also between the siblings. And so I think communication is the key thing around succession planning, and don't be afraid to bring somebody else in to assist.